Opening the king's diagonal immediately stakes central territory and prepares queen development. Solidifying the pawn chain prepares for a robust defensive structure, potentially leading to closed positions. Asserting central dominance, d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens diagonal lines for development. Challenging white's central pawn structure directly, this gambit-like push immediately creates dynamic play and seeks active piece development. Developing this knight immediately strengthens central control and prepares to support the pawn advances, anticipating potential tactical skirmishes. Releasing central pawn tension invites an open game, potentially granting white a slight initiative in piece development. Recapturing the pawn solidifies central control and opens a diagonal for the bishop. Developing the knight here subtly contests the center and prepares kingside castling, aiming for a flexible pawn structure. Developing the knight to a natural square, this maneuver prepares for further piece activation and central pawn support. Developing the knight to a natural square solidifies the pawn structure and prepares for castling, while also subtly challenging white's central control. Sacrificing the knight here opens the g-file for potential kingside pressure later, though it does invite black to recapture and solidify their central pawn structure. Consider the long-term implications for piece activity and pawn weaknesses after the dust settles. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight reestablishes a healthy pawn structure for black, simultaneously developing a piece and contesting the central squares, though it does hand white a slight lead in development. Developing the bishop to c4 now actively targets the weakened f7 square, a classic pressure point in this Caro-Kann structure, and sets the stage for potential kingside attacks while coordinating with the queen's potential influence on the d-file. Developing the bishop to this active square aims to contest the diagonal and prepare for king's side activity, but it also leaves the e6 pawn potentially vulnerable if white can exploit the knight's departure from the kingside defense. Centralizing the queen to support the d-pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion offers a solid platform for white's pieces, while simultaneously keeping an eye on black's slightly exposed kingside structure. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to develop the queen's bishop are the immediate objectives as black repositions their forces. This move clears the way for the bishop on c8, allowing it to join the fight and potentially eye the kingside. It also prevents white's knight from finding any new outposts on e6. Developing the bishop to g5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create immediate tactical threats against the e6 pawn, while also preparing to castle. Developing the bishop to g4 pins the knight, a common idea in this Caro-Kann setup, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure or force a concession. However, it risks overextending the queen's defender and might invite unwelcome pressure if white can capitalize on the centralized pieces. Consider the long-term consequences for piece activity. Embracing the long castle provides white with a more secure king, while simultaneously launching an offensive on the queen's side. Restoring equilibrium by developing the bishop, black prepares to castle, solidifying the kingside and connecting the rooks. This move subtly unblocks the queen's path while keeping options open for central pawn breaks. Challenging the bishop's advanced placement, white initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside. Exchanging the active bishop for white's knight liberates the black queen to potentially redeploy and offers an opportunity to develop the kingside further by castling. Reclaiming the pawn centralizes the queen and prepares for immediate pressure on the kingside, while also opening a diagonal for the queen to support potential advances. The knight's journey to d5 creates a complex central presence, immediately challenging the queen and aiming to unbalance white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the d4 pawn if white isn't careful. Exchanging the bishop eliminates black's most active piece and opens the g-file for potential future attack against the castled king, while also simplifying into a more favorable endgame for white. The queen's relocation immediately eyes the d4 pawn, creating a subtle but persistent tension that might force white into defensive maneuvers. Prioritizing king safety, White tucks the monarch behind the pawn shield, anticipating potential diagonal threats from black's bishop and queen, while also preparing to connect the rooks and potentially activate the knight on c3 more effectively. Centering the rook on the d-file immediately challenges white's king's safety, aiming to exploit the open lines that have emerged, while also preparing to contest any potential pawn pushes through the d-file. A strategic reorientation unfolds as the queen vacates the dangerous d-file, seeking a safer post on e4. This repositions white's most powerful piece to a more flexible square, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside dark squares or preparing for a kingside pawn advance. Notice how the queen's new position creates a potential battery with the bishop on c4, indirectly pressuring black's pawn structure should the opportunity arise. Furthermore, by moving off the d-file, white liberates the rook on d1, allowing it to join the action along the central files or even prepare for an exchange sacrifice later. This subtle repositioning aims to untangle white's pieces and prepare for a more active middle game. Unbalancing the queenside pawn structure creates immediate dynamic possibilities, though it also potentially weakens the pawn chain. Initiating a strategic repositioning, the bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential attacks on black's castled king and reinforcing the central pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, this audacious advance aims to disrupt white's already cramped king position and potentially open lines for black's rook, demanding immediate attention from white's minor pieces. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure, this pawn push solidifies white's central control and prepares to expand on the queenside itself. The queen elegantly repositions, offering potential support to the d5 pawn and preparing for future advances on the queenside. Establishing a pawn chain on the kingside with g3 solidifies white's structure, preventing potential weaknesses and preparing for future pawn advances or knight outposts, while simultaneously aiming to control the critical d4 square. Initiating a dynamic pawn thrust to exploit the weakened kingside light squares, this pawn advance injects immediate tension and aims to disrupt white's development before they can consolidate. Challenging black's pawn structure by advancing, this piece creates a powerful central outpost and aims to restrict black's queenside expansion. Unleashing the knight to f6 disrupts white's meticulously constructed pawn chain, forcing a reevaluation of central control and threatening to create weaknesses along the kingside should white castle further. Vanquishing the knight on f6 strategically realigns white's attacking potential, clearing the central files for future advances. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, black's pawn thrust into c5 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating immediate pressure against white's central pawn chain and opening diagonal lines for the queen. This audacious advance aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed defenses and seeks to gain valuable space, forcing a recalculation of white's positional strengths. The resulting pawn tension promises a dynamic and tactical battle ahead, potentially leading to a decisive rupture in the center or a strategic weakening of white's king's safety. Seeking to unravel black's compact pawn structure, white introduces a tempo-gaining threat on the f7 square, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially disrupting black's carefully constructed central control. Challenging the central pawn chain and seeking to disrupt white's queenside space advantage, this move initiates a strategic pawn sacrifice that aims to open lines for black's pieces. Seizing the opportunity, white captures the pawn on c5, disrupting black's central pawn structure and creating immediate threats. This pawn grab forces black to address the material deficit, potentially leading to a weakening of their king's defense. Consider how this unexpected pawn acquisition might strain black's pieces as they scramble to recover lost material and shore up their position. The queen trade is initiated, simplifying the position and opening a path for the rooks to become more active. This exchange, while appearing to resolve some tension, creates a structural imbalance by leaving black with doubled pawns on the c-file after the recapture. White now eyes the weakened c-file and potentially aims to exploit the isolated pawn structure that might arise later. Clearing the d-file opens up aggressive possibilities for your rook, but it also invites black's knight to a more active outpost on c5, potentially disrupting your pawn structure. Navigating the complexities of this pawn-down material deficit, Black's monarch embarks on a daring journey towards the center, aiming to activate a previously passive king and perhaps disrupt White's pawn chain dominance. The pawn's relentless march to c6 now carves out a deep salient, potentially isolating Black's queenside majority and creating immediate tension on the queenside, while also subtly restricting the potential for Black's knight to find respite on d5. The rook's relocation to the d-file aims to contest a crucial open file and potentially support advances on the queenside, while the pawn structure on the queenside remains a significant concern for Black after White's pawn push. Instantly fortifying the central e-file, White repositions the rook to a more active, protected square, anticipating potential exchanges or a swift advance on the queenside. Reclaiming the pawn opens crucial diagonal lines for your pieces, activating the bishop and preparing for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. Activating the rook on the open file offers potential for counterplay. Initiating a counteroffensive along the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt White's solidified central structure and potentially open lines for the rook. Retrieving the bishop to a more active diagonal offers better prospects for piece coordination and potential counterplay against Black's somewhat congested position. Preparing to launch the queenside pawn storm, Black's rook now scurries back to bolster its defense and await the opportune moment to rejoin the fight, recognizing that White's attack on the kingside is temporarily blunted and a counterplay on the flank is now paramount. Seizing the rook on a8 finally opens up White's advantage in material, converting the earlier pawn capture into a tangible lead that should simplify Black's defensive task significantly. Exploiting the newly opened d-file, Black forces a decisive exchange, aiming to simplify into an endgame where White's isolated pawn on c6 might become a target, though the material balance remains even after this sequence. The king now steps onto a more active square, preparing to join the fight for the open files and potentially solidify a defensive perimeter. Initiating a risky foray deep into enemy territory with the rook, Black aims to disrupt White's centralized pieces and potentially create passed pawns, though it exposes the rook to immediate danger and sacrifices valuable tempo. Seizing the open file immediately after the rook exchange, this capture aims to exploit Black's somewhat exposed king and potentially create mating threats or force further concessions. A desperate attempt to disrupt White's material advantage, this aggressive check leverages the awkward placement of White's king, seeking to create counterplay by forcing exchanges and potentially luring the king into a more exposed position before Black's pawn majority on the queenside can be fully mobilized. Securing the monarch's escape route by sliding the king into position guards against any potential discovered attacks or skewers originating from the rook on the d-file, while simultaneously preparing to support the central pawn majority should the opportunity arise for their advance. Pushing the rook forward this way immediately challenges the captured pawn's territory and eyes the newly opened diagonal for the Black king, creating a dangerous proximity. Pushing the pawn forward creates a fascinating new tension, aiming to tie down Black's rook and potentially isolate it as White's other pieces begin to coordinate their assault. The Black king, no longer shielded by its pawns, steps into the fray, a bold maneuver to support its beleaguered rook on the open file. This aggressive king march, though seemingly adventurous, aims to consolidate defensive lines and potentially launch counterplay against White's advanced pawn chain. It's a fascinating gamble, betting on active piece play to compensate for the king's exposed position, transforming a defensive posture into an offensive threat. Unleashing the rook to a more active file, White seeks to exploit the open c-file and potentially pressure Black's isolated pawns while tying down the Black king's defenses. Opening the h-file with the rook offers a dramatic, albeit risky, attempt to stir up complications in a position that has become somewhat stagnant, banking on White's king potentially becoming exposed. Unleashing a powerful discovered check, White forces the Black king to a more exposed position, disrupting any immediate counterplay Black might have envisioned. The king's exposed position on the open file invites immediate danger, forcing a swift retreat to a slightly safer square, although the fundamental structural weaknesses remain a pressing concern for black. Forcing the enemy king to shuffle back and forth again, this king march opens the possibility of a decisive rook maneuver into the enemy's weakened queen side. Black's monarch, now a target in this pawn-strewn terrain, seeks refuge, but this retreat to the central square offers a brief respite before the storm of white's rook and king advance. The monarch marches forward, a daring gamble to bolster the pawn chain and potentially activate the rook on the queen side, though it exposes him to potential checks.